The following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website at jonathanfoust.com. While you're there, you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. Thank you, and enjoy.
There's a classic story told about Mahatma Gandhi. You may be familiar with this one, but it's so illustrative. It's a story of how one of his close followers asked him if he would talk to her son because she felt her son was eating too much candy. It was a really, really bad habit, and thought some words from Mahatma Gandhi could really help him. And Gandhi supposedly said, bring him in 3 weeks. And so 3 weeks later, she brought her son, and they sat down, and Mahatma Gandhi said, you really shouldn't eat so much sugar. It's not good for you. It'd be really, really helpful if you just eat less. And it's going to make a big difference in your life. So her son listened and left. And then the mother inquired and said, why did you make me wait for 3 weeks before I brought him? And he said, well, because I had been eating a lot of candy. It really opens up a question. How do you make a difference in the world when you know you're not a perfect being? And that's a little bit of what I'd like to talk about. There's a wonderful teacher who talks a lot about social activism in a powerful way. His name is Andrew Harvey. And way, way back in the early 80s, he said how we're moving from an age of gurus to an age of wounded healers, where each of us is a healer, and yet we acknowledge that we are wounded in our own particular ways. I was always intrigued by that phrase. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that, and to talk a little bit about this fundamental impulse we have in relationship to suffering, the movement of the heart towards suffering, and what it means to be in the world as an imperfect being, yet wanting to contribute. And to talk a little bit about the archetype of the Bodhisattva, which can be a wonderful thing to reflect on. So you know what a centaur is. It's kind of half horse, half human. It's very popular in Greek mythology. And Chiron was like the main centaur. And centaurs were part human, part horse. And he was different, though, if you see depictions of him, because his front feet were human, and the back feet were horse. And most of them, all the feet are horse. So centaurs were known for being wild and lusty and overindulgent and total delinquents. But Chiron was different. He was a teacher and he was a healer. He was skilled in the healing arts, and he had great wisdom, and he instructed all the greats of that time, from Achilles to Ajax to Heracles to Jason to Perseus and to Theseus. And he was honored by living in the sky. So we have the constellation of Chiron, or Centaurus. And there was something that set him apart from all the other centaurs. He had been poisoned with an incurable wound from one of Hercules' arrows, and he was referred to as the wounded healer. So he was that archetype of the wounded healer. And Carl Jung spoke about this, that the wounded healer is one that is sort of wounded by their own arrow, and they're thrust into introversion. And this is what Jung said. A good half of every treatment that probes it all deeply consists in the doctor examining himself. It is his own hurt that will give a measure of his power to heal. This and nothing else is the meaning of the Greek myth of the wounded healer. So what that says to me is that when you encounter another person's pain, half of your work is tending to that resonating wound inside of you. And so each of us in our own way, lives in that archetype. You are a wounded healer, and in your relationship to the world, this world of suffering, you have to look toward the wounds inside yourself if you are to heal externally as well, if you're going to make a difference in the world. So we're in a pretty messed up place right now in our culture. Whether you are on the left or the right, and no doubt there are things that trigger you these days. And it's very interesting to examine how do you react to all the turmoil in the culture right now. Do you get angry and lash out in anger? Do you foster bitterness and revenge? Do you distract yourself just to get absorbed in pleasurable activities as a way of turning off your reactivity, or looking for adventures for a release? Or do you just give up? Do you look for a way out, or just as a way of numbing yourself to the anger or the sadness or the hopelessness that's going on? And these are the three classic patterns of reactivity that are described in Buddhist psychology, of greed, hatred, and delusion. These are the three poisons. How, when we're unconscious, how we react to life when things aren't going our way. And if we don't acknowledge these reactive patterns, then we're cutting ourselves off from what it means to really be awake in this world. So I don't know about you, but when I read the news headlines recently, there's sometimes my head just wants to explode. When I read about the corruption and the duplicity and the manipulation, there's a bitterness that comes up inside of me. Like there's a real kind of anarchist that arises. Am I alone in that? I don't think so. But it's fascinating to really slow it down and see what is that state that arises when you encounter the news. And the question is, can I get off that wave, or am I perpetually caught in that cycle of anger and bitterness and revenge? On the other hand, there are times when I just want to focus on what gives me pleasure. I'll seek refuge in things that make me feel good. Most of them have to do with living a privileged life. I live in a beautiful location. I live next to nature. I have creative things that I love to do. Part of that is filled with joy and gratitude and appreciation, but to be honest, part of it is an escape from just the suffering out there. It's hard to stay present to it. And then there are times when that third quality is active in my life, when I'm just sort of overtaken with confusion. What am I supposed to do in the midst of all this stuff going on in our culture right now? I don't know how to react, so I just kind of tune it out. It's like I've reached a saturation point, and I just can't be with it anymore. And so we all have our patterns. And as I've reflected on them, I certainly experience all three in technicolor sometimes. But the question is, how do you react to this world of suffering? And the core teachings of Buddhist practice are to first acknowledge that suffering exists. Stress and suffering and dissatisfaction is part of the human experience. And the second principle is to recognize there's always a cause. The cause has to do with clinging attachment. The third principle is that it's possible to let go. And the fourth is that there's a path. There are practices and observations that lead to a greater sense of equanimity, where you can respond rather than react to the stressors in your life. But it becomes a real world issue of how do you respond to what's going on right now? Is it about pausing and reflecting, examining your motivations, and then only engaging when you know what's most skillful? Or is it about just plunging ahead and kind of learning as you go? I think one of the things when we really look at how overwhelming the stressors can be in our culture right now is just to reflect that there is a genuine response we have to suffering. There's this great story I heard of a woman who was raising 3 kids and was finally decided to go back into the workplace. And she met with her potential employer, who took her out for lunch so they could talk about the job. And so they sit down at lunch, and without even thinking about it, she cut her future boss's steak into bite-sized pieces for him. And she got the job. I love that. That's the impulse, you know? The impulse is just to take care of. It's so cool right now, it being the spring, and I've gone on and on about the baby foxes, but just to see the care that the parents had for their little ones, of bringing food back and then hiding mice in the woodpile where they could find them, and now they're all out there on their night ops, doing their stuff. And seeing the eagles, how the eagles will come back and they tear the fish or the rabbits into small pieces for the eaglets. And the mergansers on the river protecting their babies. And now we've got little fawns everywhere with these super protective mothers right now. We unhesitatingly give to our tribe. Part of what's baked into us is we're committed to our DNA, our particular strain of DNA continuing. And it's interesting to sense how that sort of inborn sense of care and protection is part of who we are. So a short reflection, if you will. If you like, you can close your eyes and just let your breath deepen. And let the awareness of breath draw your attention inside. And you might just take a moment to think of somebody in your life right now who is suffering. Someone in your life is going through a hard time. And as you think of them, what is the response on the inside? And you might, in your own way, just take a moment to offer some metta, some loving kindness. Just to wish them well, to let them know that you are aware of them, thinking of them. And then if you'd like, you can deepen your breath. And you can let your eyes open, or feel free to remain with them closed. So we kind of have this inborn sense of care for those who are in our inner circle. And the question is, how can we open up that circle to include more people? One of the coolest places I've been to is a place called Cades Cove in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. Anyone been there? It is such a cool place, isn't it? It's like way, 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 way up in the mountains. And it's this valley. And it is just absolutely beautiful, incredibly isolated. And a community of people live there for many, many generations. And all the buildings have been preserved. So you can see how they lived, as this very, very small community. I really got fascinated with just the whole idea of homesteading and what is it like to kind of survive as a community living in pretty harsh conditions. Quite an isolated place. And as I kind of read about what life was like then, as a young man, if you wanted to find a partner, you had to go outside the community. So it was either how far you could walk or how far you could ride a horse to find someone outside of your tribe to raise a family with. And you could really sense there the tribalism, like these people in this cove, these people in this cove. And part of the evolution of our species has been all about expanding our sense of our tribe. At first, it was like, this is my family. I am dedicated to preserving the welfare of my family. And then it becomes, okay, well, now that you are the father of my sister's children, I'm going to include you into my circle. And then it becomes, well, now that you're a cousin, I'm going to include you in my circle. And give you a little more slack, see if we can work together. And it's like that our circle expands. And so much of the cultivation of our consciousness is about increasing the circle of our belonging. And we know that the difference in DNA between skin color and different body types is so slight. And yet, of course, this is a time of such polarization and such tribalism. And part of the challenge is to learn to recognize others as self and self as others. And when we can bridge those gaps, there can be magical moments. Story I ran across, someone saying how when he was 7 years old, he was with his family traveling to the Grand Canyon. And they had all the windows down, it was really hot, and he had his favorite blankie. And the blanket flew out the window. And he was devastated, just crying. And they pulled into the next rest stop, and they got a bite to eat. And he was starting to eat a sandwich, and a biker gang came in. And they all pulled up in their Harley Davidsons, and all the noise, and this huge, hairy, leather-clad guy, came over to their car, and they all got a little afraid. And he just said, "Is this your blue Ford?" And he said, his mother said, "Yes." And he reached in and pulled out this little blanket and gave it to them. He said he was so overwhelmed, but so freaked out by this guy that all he could do was run over, give him a sandwich, and run away again. Such a sweet story, because it's such a bridge. That bridge of kindness is so powerful. And so when we look toward what it means to heal, to be whole, we have all the great archetypes, all the great healers we refer to. Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Mother Teresa, and these other icons that represent people opening up the circle of belonging. But each of these leaders had their detractors. There was a huge amount of opposition to what they were trying to create, and a lot of opposition research to try to bring them down and shatter the image of who they were. Martin Luther King, as you know, was scrutinized by the FBI, searching for anything they could do to knock him down. And in their research, they discovered he had an ego. He was a womanizer. Mahatma Gandhi had very questionable practices, with his sexuality. Looks very strange from the Western perspective. He could be a very stubborn person. Nelson Mandela had an extremely violent past. And Mother Teresa could be a tyrant to work with. And she struggled constantly with her faith. It's so easy to focus on the shadow and discredit what's possible. But it really speaks to something really powerful, which is this idea of the imperfect healer. With each of these beings, there was this call to a greater sense of possibility, and they had their own demons. They had their own wounds. Some of those wounds were very powerful forces. When Gandhi was thrown off the train in South Africa because of his skin color, utterly humiliated, he used that energy to mobilize himself and other people to combat discrimination. When Martin Luther King's house was firebombed, somehow he was able to transcend the desire for greed, hatred, and delusion, to articulate, again, like a vision of unity, a vision of possibility. So we all have to sense this inside of ourselves. Chances are, as the more that you practice self-study and self-observation without judgment, that you have become more aware of your particular wiring. Some of us are wired for anger, to act out of a kind of a reactivity. Others of us are wired to withdraw. Others of us are kind of wired to kind of go numb, to kind of put ourselves to sleep because it's just too much. But there's also something in there, and that's part of that inner battle, is there's something inside each of us that responds to suffering, that is called to make a difference. And I think this is our deepest work in spiritual practice, to stay awake to the world and to stay awake to the inner world as well, and then to respond. So I ran across this story. The island of Lesbos in Greece. Someone was visiting the island, and they must have arrived late or something. They were walking through the streets at about 3 a.m., and I noticed that one of the cafes had dogs sleeping on the seats and in the cushions. The cafe was empty and closed, but the dogs were all comfortably stretched out on the floor and in the booths. He inquired into this, and he found out that due to the financial crisis in Greece, many people couldn't afford to keep their animals, so they just turned them out to the streets. And the cafe owner noticed that the dogs were so cold at night that when the cafe closed to the public, he would open the cafe to all the dogs, so they would all come in and get warm. The Buddha talks about, and it's kind of, the translation is, always iffy, but one of the translation is, it's the quivering of the heart in the relationship to suffering. That's the challenge, is to allow ourselves to feel the quivering of the heart in response to suffering. It's also helpful to recognize that sometimes it's too much. A lot of studies have pointed out compassion fatigue. At some point, it's just, you can't take it anymore. And there's kind of an organic process to that, where it's important to step back and refresh. But as I've mentioned before, marketers know about that. Which is why when you get an envelope around supporting a village in the third world, they don't show you the whole village. They show you one child. Because the heart can take that in, but it can't take in much more than that without shutting down. And so if you want to make a difference in the world, it is about sensitizing yourself to your reactivity and sensing your wound and the wound of the other. But there's also something about acknowledging our innate imperfections. There's a well-known teacher who I knew. He's since passed. He was in the yoga world, quite a scholar, wrote a number of wonderful books, and he was one of the first people to kind of develop the whole world of yoga therapy. And so he trained yoga therapists. And at some point in his career, he was accused of being inappropriate, sexually inappropriate with a number of people. Big scandal. But what I so admire is that he didn't get defensive. He met with a group of women. He met with a group of advisors. And they worked out a plan. And when I saw the plan, I was so blown away. That he had agreed to do a multi-year plan of looking at his issues, looking at his unmet needs. And while he was doing one-on-one work with people, he agreed over a multi-year plan to have a third party in the room as he did the work. And over time, over many, many years and many, many sessions, he gradually gained the trust of his community again. There's such deep learnings here. And such a practice when we judge other people to really ask ourselves, how do I do that? How have I done that? Am I capable of doing that? And this is a particular path of awakening. It's not a path about becoming fully purified and fully awake and then going out to make a difference in the world. It's about going out in the world and waking up in the process. And this is the real teaching of the Bodhisattva. There's a very interesting element in certain schools of Buddhism. One is a reference to what's called the arhat. And the arhat is someone who is kind of like fully realized and fully awake. And it's sort of really oversimplifying, but part of it is like, now that I'm fully realized and I see into the nature of reality, I'm out of here. Well, the Bodhisattva is very, very different. It's about using service as a vehicle of transformation and using everything you can as a vehicle for coming more fully awake. So when Nelson Mandela determined that his practice in jail was going to be to love his jailers, no matter what, he initiated a profound shift in consciousness. There are stories of Tibetan monks escaping from Tibet who were captured by the authorities in China. And their practice was to pray for their tormentors and to try not to die so they wouldn't create karma for their tormentors. When you take on that practice, something profound happens on the inside. When you see the suffering of someone and you reach out, you move from a sense of a small, tight self into something much, much bigger, much, much more mysterious. So there are many different forms of the Bodhisattva vow. In some traditions, you make a formal vow where you sort of take it on. When I got married, Tara and I elected to have our marriage vow as of one form of the Bodhisattva vow. And so the part of our vow went like this: may whatever arise serve the awakening of heart and mind and be of benefit to all beings. It's come in really handy to remember that every now and then. I remember it was maybe a couple of months after we got married, and I was just completely angry about something. I can't remember the details. And I was on some righteous mental, I had been wronged. And then that darn vow popped in, may whatever arise serve the awakening of heart and mind and be of benefit to all beings. And suddenly I just had a completely different relationship to that event. And suddenly it was like, what am I supposed to learn here? How can I convert this in a way that will benefit me and all beings? So maybe just a short reflection on that vow. If you like, you can close your eyes. And just a sense how this may resonate for you in some way. May whatever arise serve the awakening of heart and mind and be of benefit to all beings. Is there a sense of how you can convert your challenges into something that can be of benefit to all? And then if you like, you can deepen the breath and open your eyes or remain with them closed. So many people notice that when they sort of embrace this idea of the Bodhisattva, what some people have said to me is, I find now that when I feel hurt, I remember that other people feel this too. And that somehow widens the field a little bit. When I get lost in anger and revenge, I remember that the anger is coming from a deeply unmet need. And that opens something up for me. That's really helpful. Other people have said when I'm overwhelmed and I just need to shut it off and watch a movie or read a book, I try to pay attention whether that impulse is coming from self-care or if it's coming from numbing myself. And others have said when I find myself overwhelmed and wanting to numb myself, I try to be a little more kind toward that. I've done lots of research on, working with, chronic mental conditions. And one of the most powerful things you can do when you are feeling hurt or angry or depressed or feeling grief is to reach out and to support other people in their process. It's extraordinary. It's one of the most powerful things you can do when you're hurting, is to make yourself available for others. Not that it goes away, but it has a profound way of opening up the field of your sense of self. And like Chiron, like the wounded healer, there's a sensitivity that you have that can make you more available to contribute to other people. If you feel called to, particularly in this realm of mindfulness and cultivating non-judging awareness, if you feel called to support others in this, there are some very cool ways to do it. Insight on the Inside is a beautiful place to volunteer, where you get some great training to really help take these practices to people who are incarcerated, who are inevitably incredibly grateful for your time and attention. Volunteering to work with kids through Minds Incorporated, incredibly powerful. Training to be a mentor to support other people in their practice. It's the acts of kindness that help us to create that bridge. And they keep us open in profound ways. Let's close with a little meditation, a little reflection. Just sensing the breath, noticing the natural flow of the breath inside. And reflecting on this journey you've been on in this life. The inevitable wounds and disappointments and betrayals. Acknowledging in your conditioning the ways that you quite naturally self-protect. The natural play of fear and anxiety. But you also might sense this capacity to be awake right now. Your capacity to access this quality of non-judging awareness, a quality of presence. And the capacity to respond to those who are suffering. And again, you might sense someone in your life who may be struggling. And just sensing what it's like just to be aware. To let the heart respond, to wish them well. To wish them ease. Over the next minute or so, you might select other people in your life just to take a moment to wish them well, to see their goodness. And just sensing this planet and its turmoil right now. And imagining you have the capacity to wish all beings ease and well-being. And as you offer it out in all directions, just sensing if you can simultaneously offer it within, to this breath and every cell of your body. This limitless quality of compassion and kindness. And when you're ready, you can deepen the breath. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. So can I do one last little reading? This is apropos of nothing. It's just a really cool reading. It's from a Chinese poet 1,000 years ago. We're just like bugs in a bowl, all day around, never leaving the bowl. I say, that's right. Every day climbing up the steep side, sliding back over and over again, around and around, up and back down. Sit in the bottom of the bowl, head in your hands, cry, moan, feel sorry for yourself. Or look around. See your fellow bugs. Walk around. Say, hey, how you doing? Say, nice bowl. I just had to read that. Thank you so much. Enjoy class next week with Lama Tsultrim if you can make it, and I'll see you the week after. Have a great night. Thank you.